We are all part of multiple social groups. Family, peers, religious communities, nationality, the list goes on. And though we may not notice, these groups are as central and essential to our lives as eating or breathing. And it's no secret that we are all a little partial towards our fellow group members. But how deep does this partiality really go? Well, let's take a look at what the Uber director Stanley Kubrick has to say about this in his period masterpiece, Barry Lyndon. Redmond Barry, who later takes the name of Barry Lyndon, is a young Irishman who joins the British Army after he has to escape his small village because of a controversial love affair with his cousin. He travels to Europe on a war campaign where he ends up deserting the British Army, but is caught by the Prussian army and forced to join them. Here, he saves the life of his captain, who takes him under his wing and promotes him to the rank of a spy. His first mission is to spy on Irish gambler and con artist Chevalier de Balibari. But as soon as he interacts with a fellow Irishman after years far away from home, this happens.
Sir, I have a confession to make to you. I'm an Irishman.
He decides to help Chevalier and becomes his associate, betraying the Prussians. In Barry's betrayal, we see a classic case of what psychologists refer to as the in-group bias. In this video, we take a look at the definitions and history of the bias, followed by its causes, its risks and benefits, and finally ways to manage it. If you like the video, please subscribe to the channel for videos on other such biases. Now, let's get started. In-group bias is our tendency to favor the members of our own in-group over people from outside of that group. In-group bias is a member of a family of biases known as intergroup biases. Other members of this family include outgroup derogation, outgroup homogeneity, and in-group derogation. Outgroup derogation or negativity is the tendency to discriminate against the outgroup or perceive them as inferior. Examples of this are plenty and unique in every society, such as racism, communalism, tribalism, and casteism. Outgroup homogeneity is the tendency to perceive our own in-group members to be diverse and unique, but perceive outgroup members to be uniform and having the same stereotypical characteristics. For example, we perceive a lot of vibrancy and diversity in our own city or country, but perceive all the citizens of a rival city or a country to behave and think the same as per the stereotype we have of them. In-group derogation, observed to a lesser extent than other biases in the family, is the tendency to criticize the members of our own group or culture more harshly than members of other groups. This is more common among members of disadvantaged or minority communities. In-group bias has been studied by sociologists as well as psychologists. William Sumner was one of the early sociologists who observed this tendency, proclaiming how each group nourishes its own pride and vanity, boasts itself superior, exists in its own divinities, and looks with contempt on outsiders. British psychologist Henry Teifel pioneered the study of the psychological roots of in-group bias in the 1970s. To study this in the lab, Teifel and colleagues created minimal groups, wherein complete strangers are formed into groups using the most trivial criteria imaginable, such as a flip of a coin. Participants were informed that the group they were in was just a matter of chance. Next, each participant was given an individual task to award money to other participants without knowing their identity. They were only given code numbers for the other participants, which indicated the group they belonged to and nothing else. What Teifel and his colleagues discovered was that participants almost always allotted more money to other participants belonging to their own groups. Remember, they were partial towards their group members in spite of not knowing any of them, and also while being aware that they were put in the same groups because of something as meaningless as a coin toss. In other studies, Teufel even found that in minimal groups, people reported liking the members of their group better, and they even rated the members of their in-group as more likely to have pleasant personalities. In the next section, let's look at some of the causes of in-group and other intergroup biases. Causes of a bias may be either cognitive or neural. Let's start with the cognitive causes, which are the psychological mechanisms that explain the bias. Now, it is likely that no one of the multiple causes explain all the instances of the bias, and that each explanation is valid in some cases while being invalid in others. First, the social identity theory, which suggests that our self-image and self-esteem depends to some extent on our social identity, which is the status and reputation of the groups we belong to. Therefore, we perceive our social groups to be superior to maintain a positive social identity, which improves our own self-esteem. So, if I believe that my city, country, or religion are superior to others, I'm likely to feel superior as well. Secondly, the terror management theory, which proposes that to deal with the potentially paralyzing prospect of our own mortality, we seek symbolic immortality. That is, some aspect of us surviving beyond our lives. Therefore, we evaluate our in-group members positively, as they are likely to share some of our beliefs and worldviews, and through them, these shared beliefs and worldviews can survive much longer than us. Next, the realistic conflict theory proposes that each group tries to maintain or enhance their own resources, values, and well-being. Attitudes and emotions towards outgroups depend on whether that group supports our pursuit of this goal or competes with us. Lastly, according to differential processing theories, we process and remember information about in-groups and outgroups somewhat differently. As we are more familiar with the members of our own in-group, we base our impressions of them on specific individuals and subgroups, whereas we base our impressions of outgroups on stereotypical group characteristics, not individual characteristics. Now, let's look at the neural causes of the bias, which are the brain functions and other biological functions that contribute to the bias. Studies have found oxytocin, a hormone and a neurotransmitter, to be involved in producing the intergroup biases. It enables and sustains bonding, trust, and cooperation among individuals, and creating the in-group bias is one of the ways it does that. Studies have also found that it promotes a competitive approach towards outgroups in situations where we perceive a direct threat to vulnerable in-group members, even when there is no threat to ourselves. In the next section, let's look at some of the risks and benefits of the bias. First, let's take a look at the benefits. After all, for the bias to be passed down to us, genetically or culturally, from our ancestors, it must be beneficial, at least in certain conditions. We can understand the key benefits of in-group bias in terms of a system of cooperation known as generalized exchange. In this system, people unilaterally offer help without expecting anything in return. If all the members of a group follow this system, each member receives help when they need it, as other group members offer it unconditionally. This group-level characteristic benefits all group members and gives them an advantage over members of groups who don't follow this system. Now, this is known as group selection, and in-group bias provides a strong group selection advantage. Now, let's turn our attention towards the risks or the undesirable impacts of the bias on individuals as well as society as a collective. Among the intergroup biases, in-group bias is our strongest and primary drive, and it's a positive one. Although it prepares ground for outgroup negativity and derogation, especially in situations where there is intergroup competition or a threat perceived by the group. Most forms of discrimination, prejudice, partiality, partisanship, and even intergroup violence can be attributed to outgroup negativity and derogation. Individuals express outgroup negativity in their behavior even while making relatively consequential decisions. In a field experiment, Local government officials were found less likely to provide assistance to citizens with certain ethnic names as compared to their ethnically unmarked peers. Secondly, we think of morals as rules that should be applied consistently in every situation. But research suggests that we fail to apply our moral principles equally to our outgroups and ingroups. For example, liberals apply different moral standards to other liberals as compared to conservatives, and vice versa. Next, people often resist ideas, knowledge, and objects coming from outside of their groups, which creates hurdles for free flow and exchange of innovations and advancements. For example, companies sometimes fail to adopt successful practices of their competitors in order to differentiate themselves from the competitors, but this way they end up hurting themselves by resisting successful strategies. And finally, outgroup homogeneity leads to stereotyping, which impacts the social identity and self-image of the stereotyped individuals and limits the opportunities and choices available to them in the society. And in the final section, let's look at some of the ways we can manage our own bias in situations where undesirable impacts are likely. The most important antidote for all the intergroup biases is contact and cooperation with the outgroup. The best conditions for such contact include equal status for both groups in the given situation, shared goals, support from authoritative figures on both sides, and cooperation as opposed to competition. Recategorization is a social identity-based approach to prejudice reduction, wherein the members of different small groups are shown that they are the members of the same larger group by highlighting their shared values, history, and other unifying characteristics. This is how nations formed from small isolated tribes, villages, and towns. Next, perspective taking is the exercise of examining a situation from the point of view of another person or group. Even though we may never be able to fully understand another's perspective, the very act of empathizing reduces the use of stereotypes as it evokes feelings of similarity and affinity towards the other person. Another research finding is that people are less likely to endorse prejudiced beliefs once their own self-image and self-worth are affirmed. A study found that after being made to feel good about themselves, people are more likely to positively rate job candidates from stigmatized groups and less likely to employ negative stereotypes against them. And finally, the level of identification or association with a group membership influences how strongly we exhibit in-group bias towards that group. So, by introspecting about which group memberships are most strongly linked to our self-image and self-esteem, we can better navigate situations where intergroup biases may be impacting our decisions and attitudes negatively. And to conclude, let's look back at the example of Barry Lyndon. As they say, you can take an Irishman out of Ireland, but you can't take Ireland out of an Irishman. Chevalier's appearance, accent, and mannerisms would have immediately reminded Barry of his family and friends back home. His identification with the Prussian army probably never became as strong as his identification as an Irishman. But did this decision turn out in favor of Barry or not? Go watch this cinematic tour de force to find out. And now it's your turn. Tell us in the comments below how in-group bias has impacted your decisions and behaviors. And there's no need to fight. After all, we are all in the same team. See you next time.